one of the things I sometimes find difficult is this assumption that we all know as soon as we're born what we're going to be in terms of our identities. And it's like, no, identity is a constantly evolving thing for many of us. And it's a journey of discovery. And sometimes that journey branches off in different places. The important thing is that we trust ourselves and that other people trust us as to how we live in this world and what our own lived experiences are.
Hello and welcome to the 50 Shades of Gender podcast. We get curious about all things gender, sex, and sexuality, as well as relationships, feminism, the inclusive kind, neurodivergence, disability, kink, mental health, and all that makes us humans unique and diverse. From body positivity to body dysmorphia, it's all welcome here. If you appreciate this podcast and want to support us, you can visit our website, 50shadesofgender.com, as in FIFTY, to make a donation, join our community, find out more about our gender diversity and allyship workshops and courses, and how to contribute your gender story to the Anthology of Hope, for which we are now accepting submissions. Visit 50shadesofgender.com/hope for more information. Now, join us on a journey of inclusion, acceptance, and respect. I'm your host, Esther Lemons. I am a queer woman, and my pronouns are she and they. In this episode, I have a conversation with Kelsey Byers, an evolutionary geneticist and chemical ecologist, lover of all things nature, and advocate for accessibility and inclusion of minoritized groups in academia. Kelsey uses any and all pronouns, but they get little frisson of gender validation and euphoria when people don't use she and her. They are agender, asexual, disabled, neurodivergent, and queer. Find out what that means to Kelsey in this episode. We also talk about the link between gender and neurodivergence, shared experiences, assumptions and stereotyping about disability and sexuality, split attraction, the nuance of asexuality, desire and physical responses, the superpower and shadow sides of neurodivergence, how to have consensual conversations about personal subjects, and the importance of just listening. It was recorded on the 20th of June 2025. Now let's get into the episode. Hello and welcome. What's your name?
I am Kelsey Byers, and thanks for the kind welcome.
Lovely to have you. So, the gender labels that you gave me were: there was agender, asexual, disabled, neurodivergent, and queer. And I would love to talk about any and all of these. Shall we start with agender? What does it mean to you to be agender?
Absolutely. So I have wandered around my gender identity for some time, but I think one thing I always had trouble with was this idea that gender was very much a binary. And I didn't feel like I fit on either end of that binary. And even in the spectrum of gender, which we know, of course, gender is not just a spectrum, it's a multidimensional space, I didn't find anything that really fit. It wasn't gender vague, it wasn't quite gender queer, it wasn't quite non binary. I ran into the term agender actually from an online comic artist a bit before I began identifying as agender, and I read what they wrote, and it just made sense. So for me, the feeling of being agender is just I don't understand gender, I don't detect gender for myself. If I think about what gender am I, the answer is just what
Yeah.
is why do I have to have that particular attribute? That doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah.
It's a very sort of there's a space and I'm sort of just sitting sort of drifting somewhere in the space, but it's such a non huge part of my identity in some ways that gender in general, that agender just works for me quite well.
Yeah, that makes total sense, really. It's interesting because I was thinking back to way back when 50 Shades of Gender was just in the idea stage. It started with a book idea, and someone sent me a piece of writing, and they were talking about being an agender woman. And at the time, I was like, oh, that's interesting. I found it like confusing. It almost sounds conflicting. Like, if you're agender, do you still relate to the term woman, So it didn't kind of make sense to me. But as I've gone on in my own journey as well, I feel like, oh, I get that now. And in a way, I feel like, to me, like gender is like, whatever, meh. And also there is a whole lot of stuff around how we're conditioned and, all that kind of thing. But yeah, so that I feel like that is kind of resonating with me now. So I like that. Also, I think intersects with neurodivergence a lot because there are terms like neuroqueer and autigender where a lot of neurodivergent folks, or a lot, like I have no idea how many, like in proportion, but like I've heard neurodivergent folks say, I just don't get gender. Like, what? So it's yeah, I think it links with that as well. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I think there's actually a number of studies that have been done that have shown that
Ah.
gender nonconformity or being trans or being a gender other than that which one was assigned at birth is actually quite a bit more common in folks who are neurodivergent.
Mm.
And it's actually one of the things that makes neurodivergent spaces feel really safe in some ways is
Yeah.
many of the folks here are not sort of cis, straight, etc. Which if they are, that's fine, but if they're not, it sends a safety signal in some ways.
Hmm.
I think there's a term that was coined in the autistic community titled gender vague, which is the idea that you just sort of don't really quite relate to gender. How does this
Mm.
what does this why is this such an important thing? I don't understand. And
Hmm.
that also describes my own experiences fairly well, I think.
Yeah, yeah. I like that. Gender vague is fun. Yeah. Yeah, for me as well, it feels very different to have this gender assigned to you at birth based on your sex and like my own physicality or my physical experience. I think I had another podcast guest say, "Well, okay, so this is the body I landed in, so we're doing this time, and this is what I can do with it or not. So that's kind of the deal. That's where we're at. But besides that, it doesn't really mean much of anything in a way. Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree with that sort of that guest's experience. That's kind of how it feels to me sometimes.
Mm.
I use the term socialized female to try to explain that.
Oh.
So I was assigned female at birth, but I also
Hmm.
use the term socialized female to explain that the way that I was raised and the social cues that I was given as a child and as a young adult were cues that were typical of someone who is assumed to be female. And
Hmm.
so oftentimes when I'm talking about, for example, differences in how folks are raised in terms of assertiveness or what's considered acceptable behavior, I'll talk about socialized male and socialized female. But
Hmm.
it is also funny, for example, I've been in spaces that are in theory all women TM, and I feel a little uncomfortable in those spaces because I don't identify as female.
Hmm.
But I also know that there are certain experiences that people in those spaces share with me that they
Yeah.
might not share with, for example, a cis man. Um,
Hmm.
but there are also funny things, people talk about menopause or having one's period as a uniquely quote unquote female experience, which of course it's not. It's an experience of someone who has a uterus and has a lining that
Hmm.
gets shed at some regularity. And I, as someone who hasn't actually had periods for regular periods for my entire life, it feels a little bit funny to have that assumption made that this is an experience you clearly share. And I go, well, actually, no. I last bought menstrual products probably 10 years ago at this point.
Hmm. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, yeah. Like you say, there's a lot of assumptions being made about that, right? Yeah, and like the whole journey towards more gender neutral language or more inclusive language around all that is really it's been sort of at the top of my mind a lot. And also like trans men need reproductive care and all that stuff that people are a bit like, hang on, what? For the most part.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. I had
Yeah.
a wonderful experience on an airplane. I was waiting for special assistance, is the terrible term that they use for this. So I'm a wheelchair user.
Hmm.
And I was waiting to offboard the plane in Portugal. And in Portuguese, you gender certain words based on the gender of the speaker. So obrigada if you're saying thank you for if you're a woman, and obrigado if you're saying thank you and you're a man. And I
Hmm.
was like, I don't really like either of these terms. Is there some other option? And I got the sense that the other person who's waiting for assistance might know the answer. So this is someone we'd been chatting, and this person had lived in Portugal for a while, but was
Hmm.
originally from the UK, and just gave off sort of gender nonconforming vibes. And I said, really silly question. Do you know the answer to my conundrum? And they said, oh yeah, we use obrigade.
Ah.
And I said, that was just such a wonderful feeling that there was a way around my conundrum, and B, that I had run into this random person waiting for assistance off an airplane who knew the answer to my conundrum. It felt really
That
welcoming.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, I love that. Hmm. Language is such a thing, isn't it? And I think in English we've got it easy in ways with the they them neutral pronouns. Not that everyone necessarily likes them or wants to use them, but they are like an easy thing. Even though people argue like, "Oh, singular they, what is that about?" I'm like, "Yeah, it's been around for hundreds of years." Yeah, so whatever, right?
Exactly. I still remember my English teacher in secondary school correcting me when I used they and saying, no, the singular when you're not specifying a gender is he. And that's
Hmm.
I took that as correct because it was my English teacher, and it wasn't until later that I
Wow.
was able to adjust my writing to go back to no, actually singular they is perfectly fine.
Hmm. Gosh, a teacher. Amazing, isn't it? Hmm. Wow. I was just thinking about the term queer. So, what does the term queer mean to you?
It's an interesting one. Queer for me is a term that I used for quite a while to self-identify when I kind of knew about my sexuality, so I'm asexual. I didn't really know quite what was going on with my gender at that point, and I started using the term queer because it defined an umbrella term that explained that I was not the default assumption of our society in terms of my gender and sexuality, shall we say. And so for me, queer is kind of an umbrella term that folks use when they're not sure, when they do identify as an LGBTQIA plus person. Obviously, the term queer is also a generational term. So my sister, who is a straight cis woman, actually finds the term queer quite difficult, even
Hmm.
for me, because she's a little bit older, and for her, queer was a slur, very much so. And she's,
Hmm.
as not being a member of the community, she hasn't reclaimed it, which makes sense. But sometimes it is weird that, like, but I should be allowed to use this word to self-define myself, right? Right.
Hmm.
So the word queer works really well for me, but I do know it doesn't work for everybody, certainly. And I've
Hmm.
heard people use it, talk about it as a slur that's equivalent to them to some other words that we know are very, very socially unacceptable slurs that are
Hmm.
based around race, for example.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I use it for myself, but I'm also aware to not use it for other people unless they embrace it, you know? Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly. I think one of the most important things is asking people what language they like to use,
Mm.
and how they prefer to identify, and also what context they're comfortable using that language in. So, for example, oh, I know so and so is queer, but I may not want to tell their work colleagues that they're queer because they may not be out at work, even if they're out in their personal life, and so on and so forth.
Mm. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's the thing that there's so many assumptions that are easily made. Like if someone comes out to you or is out to you, doesn't mean they're out in other places necessarily. So it's always important to be like, don't accidentally, out someone in the wrong environment and stuff. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. You just mentioned being asexual. Would you elaborate on that a little bit and what that is like for you? And you also talked about when we first met at an event here in Norwich, you mentioned something about disability and people assuming that you're ace if you're disabled. So I would love to talk about that some more as well.
Absolutely. So I have kind of always known I was asexual in a lot of ways. I didn't identify with the word, strictly speaking, until I was a little bit older. But I remember doing a quiz, one of these silly online internet quizzes in the late 90s, early 2000s, where you could learn about yourself by filling out questions. And it was like, did you know you might be asexual? And I was like, oh, actually, that makes a lot of sense. So for me, I just, I'm not sex repulsed in the way that some asexual people are. So people who are asexual can vary in their responses to thinking about sex, to the thought of themselves having sex or other people having sex. And for me, it's just eh. Reminds me a little bit of my feelings about gender. It's mostly just it's cool that you can go and do that over there, but I really don't care. Like that's not an experience that relates to me.
Yeah,
And
like no
I'm not,
thanks. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Exactly. I'm not sex repulsed. I am sex positive for other people who want to have sex.
Hmm.
So like if other people want to enjoy exploring their sexuality, you go right ahead, you do it. That's awesome. It's just not something that I personally feel compelled to do. And you mentioned the intersection with disability, which is one that I found really interesting. So there's kind of this weird intersection between asexuality and disability, both from the public sphere as well as from within the disability community. So from
Mm.
the public sphere, people assume, oh, you're a wheelchair user, you're physically disabled, you must not have sex. That's impossible. How could you possibly have sex, and how could someone be attracted to you and all this, right? This very
Mm.
negative stereotyping. And therefore often the assumption is made that, oh, you must be asexual either by choice or just because you have no opportunities, right? And this is
Mm.
obviously not true. There are plenty of physically disabled people who have absolutely wonderful sex lives, right? With partners, without partners, totally whatever works for them. Within the disability community, there's been a rejection of this idea that disabled folks are not sexual creatures. And this rejection of this idea has often manifested as a very strong sex positivity around disability. So you are disabled and you are empowered to have sex, and you can have sex in whatever way works for you. You can use toys, you can have a partner, you can have multiple partners, whatever. But the downside to that approach is that if you are asexual, or you're not sexually interested, or you're not sexually engaged, you can be accused of being internally ableist. And so what that means when I say internally ableist is that you are believing the stereotypes that society has given you, the public, in the public sphere, around your own body and your sexuality and so on and so forth. And so from the public, you're
Mm.
being told you're asexual because you're disabled. And from the disability community, you're often being told you're asexual because you're internally ableist and you haven't accepted yourself yet. But the reality
Right.
is, some of us who are disabled are asexual, just like the rest of the population has a proportion of asexual people. And absolutely, there are definitely cases where the two of them can be involved with one another. But there are also cases like mine where it's probably just the fact that I was born asexual and I also was born with a genetic disease. These two things don't have to correlate.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, that's such a good point, really. Yeah, so many kind of like between, oh, what is the expression even? I don't think my brain's working, but like, yeah, stuck between these two, you know, paradigms or whatever.
Yeah, like
Um,
a rock and a hard place, sort of.
that's the one. Yeah,
You
yeah,
can't be
yeah.
accepted in either situation for just who you are, which you would
Yeah.
hope you'd be accepted for who you are. And we
Mm.
also have the intersection between queerness and disability. So not all queer friendly spaces are accessible for in a variety of ways. Not all
Mm.
disability friendly spaces are queer friendly. You would think that being members of different minoritized groups, we would try to hold each other up rather than pushing
Right.
sideways or pushing down. But unfortunately, that doesn't always happen.
Mm.
I've been to multiple Pride events, for example, and multiple LGBTQIA plus hangouts that have been not the most accessible events, shall we say.
Mm. Yeah, that's too bad, really. You would think people would be more informed, or I don't know, or just a bit more with it in that way. Yeah. Yeah. Talking about asexuality, this is really interesting because I've recently heard people talk about, I think they're confusing asexual. Sometimes they say asexual when they mean intersex, when people are intersex. And that's really, I've heard it a couple of times recently. I
Huh.
don't know why I'm bringing this up, but obviously very different things. So I think when they say, oh, people are born with intersex characteristics, they think they're asexual, which is, yeah, so interesting.
That, and I could see that going with agender as well, as sort of
Yeah.
oh, we don't know what to do with you, so we're going to put you in this bucket of without a gender or without a sexuality, rather than using the term that the community has validated that works for itself,
Mm.
intersex.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Very interesting. And also, like you say, the A in front of agender and asexual and stuff, it's kind of like what I've heard some ace people say is it's almost like if you don't want to have sex in the conventional acceptable ways, then it's like you're invalid. Your sexuality is invalid rather than be like, well, if you're in this universe of like, not it's not about like a spectrum necessarily, as you said in the beginning, but there's this whole universe of possibilities. And you might have different interests. You might be able to, do certain things, but not others, or be interested in, that's a yes, that's a no. There's a lot of nuance in that space. But it's kind of like, yeah, like you almost get erased, like your sexuality isn't valid if you're not, like, or if you're ace, or people make assumptions about that. Have you found that?
I have definitely.
Mm.
I was riding in a car with a an intern I was supervising, and we had another gentleman who was driving the car, and we happened to get onto the topic of queerness, and it turned out the driver was gay, and so we were talking about that. And this really insensitive other person said, "Oh, when did you decide to be gay?"
Yeah.
It was like, "Oh gosh, not this again." People don't decide to be whatever orientation they are. People are, hey, people are born that way and they're shaped that way by the experiences they have. But primarily, we know it's an inborn thing, right?
Mm.
But then I mentioned that, well, I'm asexual, and he didn't understand what that meant. So I defined it, and he said, "Oh, so you're psychotic, is what you're saying."
What?
Yeah.
Oh
So
my goodness.
Yeah, it was very, very difficult to hear that. He was like, "Well,
Wow.
every standard person, every normal person," he used that term, which I don't it's not a term I'm fond of. "Every normal person has a sex drive and wants to have sex," which, by the way, are 2 different things, of course, as you obviously know. So therefore, you just must be insane.
Hmm. Wow. Good grief.
Yeah.
Yeah. Actually, let's talk about that a little bit. The nuance there, like the difference between being asexual, like sex drive, and all that stuff. Like, would
Yeah.
elaborate on that a little bit if you would?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one commonly misunderstood thing about asexuality is this idea that asexual people don't have sex,
Yeah.
can't have sex, never want to have sex, etc. And it's about attraction. It's not about what one does, right? So this is similar to the Kinsey's original models of sexuality, which obviously are very dated at this point.
Mhm.
But they were about attraction, they weren't about behavior. And so the idea with asexuality is that you're not sexually attracted to people. And of course, it is also a multidimensional spectrum. So people can be more or less sexually attracted to folks.
Mhm.
But that doesn't necessarily have any bearing on whether one has arousal, sexual desire, physical arousal, wants to engage in sex with a partner, wants to engage in sex alone. There are a lot of issues in the community, actually. I would say less in the asexual community, but sometimes in the queer community,
Mm.
broadly speaking, the LGBTQIA plus community, where if you are an asexual person who has a sexual partner or has arousal, that you are not actually asexual, that you're
Mm.
invalid. Again, it's that invalidation of someone's lived experience because we need to put them in a box that makes sense to us, which is silly.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
there's the separation of desire and attraction from what are honestly in some cases physiological responses that our bodies do, right?
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Totally. Yeah. You talked about split attraction when I saw your talk. So, would you elaborate a bit on what you mean by that?
Absolutely. So the split attraction model is one that it's come to light fairly recently, fairly in the sense of years, not in the sense of months.
Mhm.
And the idea is that attraction actually is a multidimensional space, just like everything else. Of course, it's always more complicated on the inside than it seems on the outside. And it's actually quite interesting. I just filled out a survey yesterday, a scientific study, a sociological study on attraction and different levels and types of attraction. That's the survey is trying to talk to both straight cis folks as well as folks of any identity under the queer spectrum. But the idea with split attraction in particular is that our romantic attraction, who we're attracted to romantically, who we want to make a life partner or a long term partner, or who we find a comfortable person to be around, someone who wants to maybe cuddle with, someone we want to have a nice dinner with, could be distinct from our sexual attraction. So, who we want to actually do something sexual with anywhere on the spectrum, from kissing all the way to various sexual acts, right? And so, for example, myself, I am asexual, but I am biromantic or panromantic, depending on who you talk to. I'm basically romantically attracted to people of any gender, but not sexually attracted to people, right? And
Mhm.
so there's often this sort of people talk about sort of the triple threat TM. So there are folks who are agender, asexual, and aromantic. So all three A's, right? And I
Mhm.
am agender and asexual, but I'm definitely not aromantic.
Yeah.
So I have a life partner. We've been together for 20 years. We enjoy cuddling. We enjoy sitting on the couch together. We sleep in the same bed. I'm romantically attracted to him. It's been a wonderful 21 years. Does that mean I am sexually attracted to people in general? It does not. Right? So these are
Mhm.
two different things, and sometimes it can help folks think about their own feelings and identities when we split these things into more fine nuances. So rather than saying, "Oh, you are asexual, so you must also be aromantic and you must not want to ever have a relationship," we can say, "Yeah, you might want to have a relationship, and it may or may not involve a sexual relationship, but your romantic identity can be different from your sexual identity."
Mm. Yeah, that's such a good point because sexual and romantic attraction get lumped together in this one block, don't they? And that is set as the pinnacle of relationships and society. But also, yeah, there's different kinds of attractions, and there might also be, as you mentioned, more if you take each kind of attraction as an individual thing and then think which people am I romantically attracted to and which people am I sexually attracted to or aesthetically or platonically or all these things. And there could be, it might vary. Yeah, I find that a really interesting exercise, actually. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And it can vary over our lives as well, I think, based on our own experiences.
True.
We can, just as folks can have different gender identities throughout their lives and so on, we
Mhm.
can be romantically attracted to folks in one identity space when we're teenagers and romantically attracted to folks of a different identity space when we're older. It really depends. I think one of the things I sometimes find difficult is this assumption that we all know as soon as we're born what we're going to be in terms of our identities. And it's like, no, identity is a constantly evolving thing for many of us. And it's a journey of
Mhm.
discovery. And sometimes that journey branches off in different places. The important thing is that we trust ourselves and that other people trust us as to how we live in this world and what
Mm.
our own lived experiences are.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. So you are a scientist, aren't you? Like you, yeah, you're a scientist. And when I saw your talk, you were talking about plants and flowers and bees and the science of sex and differences between sex and gender. And I found that really interesting. What made you go into this field? Do you feel like it had something to do with like who you are, like as part of your identity, perhaps, to maybe understand your own self better, or was it more of a separate thing? And what have you gotten out of this field of study that you're in?
Those are really great questions. For me, it's a separate thing. It actually started with I was trained in university and in a research assistant position after university. I was very much a molecular biology, genetics kind of person, look at a cell and figure out what it's doing. And I actually got quite bored with that. And I found myself going, there was a tree outside the window in my office, well, my lab office, when I was a research assistant. And I was like, why are there trees? This is much more interesting than what I'm doing right now. And so when I went to start my graduate studies, I actually changed fields to evolutionary genetics. So I was still using the genetics, but I was trying to understand the evolution of species and how species are kept separate from one another. So why, for example, don't I don't know, blue whales hybridize with fin whales, things like that, right? And so I had the choice of studying either mice or flowers in two different labs in two different universities. And I ended up going with the flowers for a variety of reasons. And it turned out to be the best choice for me in a large number of ways. One of which was that when I'm done with the experiment, the flowers can go in the compost and I don't feel that bad about it. But one of the things that's always amused me about flowers is that the flower species that I studied then and that I still study today, they don't have sexes, right? So this is really funny. If you go onto a website like iNaturalist, for example, and you submit a photograph of a flowering plant, it'll say, okay, is the organism alive or dead? How do you know what it is? Does it have flowers? Does it have leaves? And then they ask you what the sex is, and I'm going, but this is just a flower. The flower doesn't have a sex. Because the species I study have both male, quote unquote, male and quote unquote female parts in the same flower. But there's problematic language in this area. So we call those quote
Mhm.
unquote perfect flowers. And that is honestly troubling, right? One should
Very.
not, yeah, one should not need to have parts of different functions, an egg parent and a sperm parent in the same flower to be called quote unquote perfect. But I just went to a talk a couple of weeks ago on what this person was talking about with sex determination in flowering plants. So how do different flowering plant species determine which parts of the flowering plant the individual flowering plant will have which functions, an egg function or a sperm function, for example. And the point that she made was that the way that we think about sex determination is very mammal centric and it's very human centric. And it's also very binary centric, right? And so she was like, but plants don't do that. They have a huge, huge universe of different ways that plants express sexual function. And so to talk about it as though plants have sexes is actually quite misleading in a lot of ways. It's an oversimplification. I did find one thing quite funny in my PhD, however. I was studying a plant species that was pollinated by hummingbirds and one that was pollinated by bumblebees and their relationships to one another and what kept them from hybridizing in the wild and so on. And I could legitimately say that I worked on the birds and the bees.
Oh, I love that. Ah, yeah. Is there anything in your like field of study that made you go like, oh wow, this is so like it make connections maybe in your own mind about, not how it relates to humans and sex and gender and the difference, but like, I don't know. Is there something there?
It's a good question. I think just working with the natural world and seeing the diversity of different reproductive systems in the natural world.
Mm.
There's a species, so I study monkey flowers, are one of the groups of species that I study. And there's a species that lives in Colorado that reproduces, the term we use in science is asexually, which of course as an asexual person I find hilarious
Yeah.
because it's not at all the same thing. But
Yeah.
this plant actually, it almost never flowers and it just reproduces by sending out vegetative parts of it, kind of like a strawberry, how it sort of makes new plants from by sending out little runners. And I found that just quite interesting that seeing the diversity of different ways that one can reproduce in this world, that one can express oneself in this world. I think the natural world we tend to oversimplify a lot of the time. But I think when you really look at it with a closer eye, you really see that there are so many different ways to be an organism in its environment.
Hmm.
And the fact that those organisms are connected and have relationships with one another. So, for example, the pollination that I study is a relationship often between an animal and a plant. How did that come to be? Like, how did it come to be that an animal moves sperm from one plant to another? That seems very strange. And so that it's almost that wonder
Hmm.
and that magic, which then leads you to think, humans surely are more diverse than just these binaries that we like to pack ourselves into. These
Hmm.
gender binaries, these binaries of sexuality, you're either gay or you're straight, you're either male or you're female. We know these things aren't true. And I think the natural world helps us realize the fact that actually this isn't the case, as well as
Hmm.
also supporting sometimes with real data from natural species the fact that, you know, it's being gay is not an evolutionary disadvantage, right? It's often cited as one, but there are all sorts of manner of creatures out there that are gay. And guess what? This is a natural behavior, right? So it does support
Hmm.
some of the fact that no, this is not a quote unquote unnatural thing, which is what a lot of queer hating folks like to cite. So
Hmm.
that was
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. I was wondering, one question that came up for me is, what do you wish people didn't ask you or say? Or like you said when you were in that car during that car ride, that was like, oh my goodness, how can people even just throw that out there? Like, anyway, yeah. Anything else that you can think of that you wish people might not say or ask you, and what you would like them to do instead?
That's a great one. I think assumptions are actually one of my biggest bugbears, to be honest. The number of times I've been in a meeting with people who all were assigned female at birth, and someone says, "Oh, we're all women here. How nice." Or,
Uh,
"Oh, this paper, all the authors are female. It's so nice to be different than, my usual work or whatever." And I'm sitting here going in the corner like, "Okay, do I need to raise a stink? Do I need to challenge this person's assumptions? Should I just stay quiet?" But now I don't feel welcome in this space because the space is now
mm,
suddenly not for me, right?
yeah.
And so I think it's funny because people are doing this to try to be inclusive in some ways, but it's almost acting as the opposite. And I think similarly, you get a lot of assumptions made about, oh, you have a male partner and you're assigned female at birth, and I assume that you're female, so therefore you must be straight. There have been times when I've gone into queer spaces and I've explained that I have a male partner, and I've gotten looks from people. Are you an ally?
Mm,
Like, no, I'm not an ally. I myself am actually a queer person. The identity of my partner has not much to do with my sexuality and my gender.
mm,
But people make those assumptions because the majority of society, TM, falls into a certain group of people. And so we don't think about the fact that not everyone falls into that group. Like, I have long hair. I tend to wear clothing that is tailored for AFAB bodies, assigned female at birth bodies, because it fits my body better because I was assigned female at birth. That doesn't mean that I'm not actually agender, right? There's kind of this stereotype that folks who are gender nonconforming are identifiable instantly. You can stare at them and go, oh, that person's gender nonconforming. But actually, the external expression and the internal experience are two separate things again.
mm. Yeah, that's such a good point because I have a friend who's non-binary, and because they are AFAB and femme presenting, just people misgender them all the time. And like even people that, they work with and stuff like that, just use she, her pronouns. And I'm a bit like, hello, you know this person. Like, what is up with that? So yeah, yeah. There is like, especially I think in the non-binary space, so much to do with like you have to be androgynous, you have to present androgynous to be taken seriously as a non-binary person.
Hmm.
And like there's a lot of gatekeeping, like even inside the community. I think not necessarily all. What do you call it? not malicious necessarily at all, but just like, oh, like based on assumptions again, and all this internalized stuff that we have from when we're born, to be honest. Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. And
Mm,
it's, you know, people are taking mental shortcuts. Our brains are wired to take mental shortcuts to save us
mm,
effort. And this makes sense, but it's important not to, I think, not to take those shortcuts when it comes to other human beings. We have
mm,
to really be aware of those shortcuts that we want to take and really, in some ways, go, but is that assumption that I'm making true? Right.
mm. Yeah, I think it takes a lot of inner reflection that I think a lot of people maybe are not willing or able to do, but it does involve being open to being wrong, which is uncomfortable. It's very uncomfortable. But I've been in a space myself. Oh my god, I might get it wrong, so I'd rather say nothing at all, And now I'm a bit like, okay, I need to speak up at times, But also like kind of like yourself, that you're in a situation and people make assumptions and it's all happening outside of around you, and then you're like, oh, should I say something? It's a lot of emotional labor,
Hmm.
that you have to do as a queer person to, yeah, to not educate people, but to even just gently ask them to self-reflect in ways. And you might not always have the spoons for that. I know I don't. So I do what I can, and other times I'm like, okay. Yeah.
Yes. A lot of it depends on my relationship with the person, how whether I think I'm going to see them again, etc.
Yeah.
I had a colleague, so my Twitter profile at the time, I don't use Twitter anymore, but my profile at the time said I was asexual. And he met with me. We were meeting over tea to be a little bit social colleague time and a little bit professional colleague time, right?
Hmm.
He's like, so I saw on your Twitter profile that you're asexual. What is that? And I was sitting there going like, we're in a work context in a public place. I'm
Hmm.
public about it on Twitter, but this is like mildly uncomfortable conversation to be having. And also, you found it on a computer with Twitter. Presumably, this computer has a search engine. You could have put the word asexual into the search engine and probably found a Wikipedia article or the Avon Network's information or something, rather than asking me point blank, please define your sexuality for me. I don't understand.
Yeah.
It
And
was just,
sometimes it's not even define, it's almost like justify. Because I had a reading once. I'm a book in the human library, or I used to be, and my book title was pansexual. And there was a guy who sat down with me, and it's almost like he was expecting me to back up my label with scientific evidence and stuff like that. He was a bit like, he was very, not aggressive, but very. There was some vibes coming off him anyway. So yeah, I think people expect you to almost, or sometimes can expect you to either educate or explain or justify or back by scientific evidence or whatever. And it's like,
absolutely.
well, I don't owe you anything actually. And also, like you said, the context and the environment. I feel like what might have been a better thing to say or ask is, I absolutely think he should have done his own research, like look up what it is. But if you say, hey, what does being asexual mean to you? That's a different question. But also in the context, it might have been good to say, hey, do you mind if I ask you a personal question right now? Just lead into it and ask for like the consent factor, is
Absolutely.
is huge. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think there's a lot of overlap with disability there as well. When
Mm.
your body, your sexuality, your gender don't fit into those categories that society thinks exist, people feel entitled to that information and they feel
Mm.
entitled to understanding why you don't fit into that category. So, for example, like I said, I'm a wheelchair user. The number of random people, not even strangers, but like people I work with that I'm not close to, oh, why are you in a wheelchair? Why is that your business?
Mm.
Can we not have a professional conversation about what we're actually doing together as scientists? Or could you, like you said, frame the question as, I'd like to ask you a personal question. Please feel free to say I don't want to answer. Feel free to say no, or feel free to not answer, right? So giving that
Mm.
consent. But a lot of it feels like people feel like they have the right to that information about ourselves and
Mm.
our stories. And it happens for members of all minoritized groups, just to be clear. So folks who are racially and ethnically diverse, they get asked like, oh, what's it like being a Black woman? It's like, maybe this person doesn't actually want to have this conversation right now. Maybe they
Mm.
want you to see them as a human being, rather than a collection of identities without a human being at its core.
Hmm. Yeah. And I think a lot of people could do themselves a lot of favors, I think, by just thinking, oh, this question is arising in me. Let me look that up when I get home, like, or even beforehand or whatever. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
Absolutely. And I think,
Yeah.
I think many people are very happy to provide pointers to good resources or to have a brief surface level conversation, or if it's someone that we have a good relationship, have a very deep conversation.
Hmm.
But like you said, it's a lot about that consent and about people being willing to put in their own labor rather
Hmm.
than relying on the labor of the person who is honestly usually already spending a lot more effort to be in this world that's just simply often doesn't accept that we exist.
Hmm. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. We talked about agender, asexual, disabled, neurodivergent. Would you like to? I mean, I would love for you to share more about what being neurodivergent means to you, and what neurodivergence is your flavor, if you know, and yeah, a bit more about that.
Absolutely. So I am autistic and I have ADHD as well. I also have auditory processing disorder, which is sort of a neurodivergence where the ears, if you go and do a standard hearing test at the shop, my ears test perfectly fine. But if you do what's called a hearing tested noise, where you play background noise, I have the cocktail party problem magnified by 1,000, which means that I have a lot of trouble understanding speech in noisy environments, more so than most people.
Mhm.
Presumably, people are probably familiar with autism and with ADHD, but basically, in summary, I have a lot of trouble personally with executive functions. So things like responding to emails in a timely fashion, paying my taxes in a timely fashion, remembering what we need to get at the grocery store if I don't have a list, remembering that it's time to go and eat dinner because time inattention is a big issue with ADHD in particular.
Mm.
So this is some people talk about neurodivergence as a superpower, and there are parts of my life where it can be. So for example, I write as part of my job, right? And I can sometimes sit there and just crank out several pages of writing in the space of a few hours just by buckling down and just doing what we call hyper focus, where essentially I forget that I might need to go to the toilet or eat or drink or move because I'm so focused on what I'm doing, which is handy. The downside is because of those things I've forgotten, when the hyper focus finally stops, I'm starving, really need to pee, and also my body's in a lot more pain than usual because I haven't
Mm.
moved it. So
Mm.
it's got the useful side, the superhero side, but also the shadow side. And I think that's something that a lot of people forget because the neurodivergence movement is often presenting itself as very much a we think differently, we don't think we aren't disabled. And that's not true for many neurodivergent people that I know. We definitely do think differently and we definitely do have strengths, but we talk about spiky profiles where on the list of sort of executive functioning skills and things that folks can do, you may be really good at some things and really not so great at other things. Whereas
Mhm.
a neurotypical person, quote unquote, might be a little bit more of a flat line on that spiky profile, where they're average, pretty good at most things, as opposed to really great and then really rubbish like I am.
Mhm.
It's interesting because, as we talked about earlier, neurodivergence does have that link to gender for many people. And I think some of it is about autism, for example. There's that gender vague identity again of people don't make sense to me in some ways. And therefore, why would gender be a label that also made sense? Because it's not a clear cut box that I can put people in because that's wrong. And so, gender, huh? What's that? Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think also
Mm.
when one is when one is different in any way, I think it's easier for one to accept that one might be different in multiple ways.
Mm.
And so, for example, I'd always known that something was funky about my thinking and about my executive function ever since I was a small child. I wasn't actually diagnosed until my 30s, but I was sent for special education, terrible term, testing
Mm.
when I was in third year in school, right? And the result was the child is bored, send the child to a therapist.
Mm.
But trying to think where I was going with this. But I knew something was different about me, and I think that made it easier to accept. And I knew that I had chronic pain, and I knew that I had joint dysfunction, and so on. So it was easier to accept that other things might also be different about me. We talked a little bit in the beginning, I think, when we had our initial conversation about trans identities, for example. So I do identify as trans. It's something that it's taken me some time to come to to come to grips with that because I don't share many experiences with many of the binary trans people that I know. And so sometimes it feels almost appropriative to be like, I'm trans, but I don't have gender dysphoria, and I don't have a desire to take hormones or have surgery. And it's like, no, 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 that's not what trans
Mhm.
is about, right? Trans is just, is your gender identity different than that which was assigned at birth?
Yeah.
But I was actually really lucky in a lot of ways that accepting my sexuality and my gender identity were really easy for me because I grew up in a family that was very accepting. And that is not true for a lot of our LGBTQIA plus folks, right?
Hmm.
So my stepfather's, he came into my life when I was 2 years old, and his university roommate was actually one of the first trans activists in the state that we lived in the United States.
Wow.
And so I knew that John was actually Nancy and that I should call Nancy Nancy, right?
Mm.
From a very young age. And then it wasn't until probably I'd heard the terms gay in a pejorative sense earlier, like when I
Mm.
was in, middle school and secondary school, but it wasn't until I met actual out gay folks that I was like, oh, there are folks who are actually gay. Okay. And like they were family friends. My parents were really accepting. My dad was, he had his issues, but towards the end of his life, he became more accepting of LGBTQIA plus folks. But that's a privilege that not everyone in our community has, right? And
Hmm.
I think that's something that societally is really difficult because it's one thing for the news and society and various court decisions and so on to say, oh, you're an invalid human being. But it's another thing for your own family to say that you're an invalid human being or a sinner or
Mm.
otherwise. It's very, very hard for people to cope with.
Hmm.
And I thankfully did not have that experience.
Hmm.
I was really
Oh,
lucky.
that's good. Yeah. 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 Hmm. Yeah, and especially with stuff that's going on at the moment, it's like wow. And even like here in the UK as well, as the US. Yeah.
It's just,
Mm.
it's appalling, honestly. I mean,
Mm.
the Supreme Court decision came down about gender, and I went, okay, well, that's rubbish. And then all of a sudden it got rolled overnight into all of these policy decisions that suddenly were going to happen.
Mhm.
And I've been really grateful to my workplace that, for example, they haven't had a policy suddenly emerge that trans folks have to use the toilet assigned to them at birth.
Mhm.
But that's not true everywhere. And that's really,
Yeah.
really, really concerning.
Very. Yeah, very. It's interesting because I see it in a way of like there's no more sitting on the fence, like the fence is gone. So now your decisions will speak for you in ways when it comes to people, but also companies and, all that stuff. And yeah, yeah. Hmm.
Absolutely. And I think in some ways it's almost more painful coming as an expat. And my trans friend has said the same to me as well because he came over from the US also at a separate
Hmm.
time to the UK. And it almost feels like more of a betrayal because we left a country that we thought was probably going to be unreasonable for a country that we thought was more reasonable. And then the country is suddenly discovering that actually it's come off the fence. There is no more fence, like you said. And
Mm.
it's painful because one felt safer here sometimes and one doesn't always feel safer here anymore. And that's a very
Mm.
difficult experience.
Yeah. Yeah. On that note, I mean, do you have anything? Is there anything that you want to add that we haven't talked about yet? And also, what do you think needs to change? What can allies do? Is there anything there that you wanna add?
That is a good question. I had something that I wanted to mention earlier, but I think it sort of slipped my mind. But in terms of things that folks can do, I think, listening is a really, really powerful thing that a lot of folks forget about. When I talk about, so I do seminars on disability and equity work in science, and I think the two things that I try to stress to folks in those that I would hope that most folks listening here would take away as well is that communication and trust are incredibly important. So communication is bidirectional, right? It's not just saying your own experience, it's also listening to other folks' experiences. And it's important that folks that are societally marginalized are allowed to share their own experiences and their own voices, even if those voices and experiences are uncomfortable for other people to hear, right? I think there's
Mhm.
this narrative that you can't be the angry trans person or the angry gay person or the angry disabled person or the angry black person or whatever, right? And no, that is honestly not okay. Like you are allowed to be angry. You are allowed to share experiences that make other people uncomfortable because they're real things that have happened to you, right? And then I think the other thing that's critical is that trust element that when people share those experiences with us, we trust that that's what happened, right? We don't go, "Oh, but are you sure that they didn't mean it that way? Oh, but I'm sure they meant to say X, Y, Z. Oh, but that wasn't their intent." And it's like, no, actually, the person was harmed, and that matters. That's valid.
Yeah.
And so we need to trust that when folks say, "No, that actually hurt me," or "No, there was hostility there," that that was what happened. I
Mhm.
think it's very easy for members of majority groups to try to erase the uncomfortable experiences of members of minoritized groups, and that needs to stop.
Yeah, definitely, because it's very gaslighty, and I mean,
Absolutely.
if you relate it to like even women speaking up about experiences they've had, in a way, it's like, are you sure? Maybe you were just like, hello, that's gaslighting, and all that stuff. Is there anything else that you would like to add that we haven't talked about yet?
I think just encouraging folks not to make assumptions about folks' identity, about gender, about anything like that. And if you're curious, it's usually okay to ask as long as you can preface it with the consent thing that we discussed earlier, right? I have a personal question, but also to normalize some of that non personal question asking. So if you are in a circle of people talking at a conference, ask, "Oh, my name is so and so, and my pronouns are XYZ."
Mhm.
Or, "Oh, you're introducing me to your friend. Can I ask, friend, what pronouns do you use, for example?" And that's like
Mhm.
a question that is not intrusive and allows you to relate to that person in a way that respects them, which I think is really important.
Mhm.
It also signals a certain amount of safety to folks because you're signaling to them, "Oh, I recognize that this might be something that's important to you. And I'm setting
Yeah.
a tone that I'm going to respect that by asking you for what you need," right? I
Mhm.
saw a talk at a professional conference where someone put their pronouns on the title slide, and I was like, yes, that is exactly what I want to be doing. That is such a good idea. And it made me instantly more comfortable around that person because I knew that person was thinking about gender as not just an assumption.
Yeah, and it's
So,
interesting how something so small in ways can have a big impact, and it helps people feel safer, because that is, yeah, I think that is part of the main conversation. And the reason everything is so out of control at the moment is because different conversations are being conflated, but also we all want to be safe.
absolutely.
Mm.
And I think people from majority groups sometimes forget that there is actually a real element of safety. It's physical safety as well as mental safety, emotional safety, etc.
Mhm.
People are still being victimized. This is not an issue that has been resolved.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing, Kelsey.
Thanks. It's been really great having this conversation.
Yay. You can find out more details on the website at 50shadesofgender.com/Kelsey, which is Kelsey, where you can also read the transcript. And you can find Kelsey on their website, plantpollinator.org, and on Blue Sky at Plant Pollinator. Thank you for listening to the 50 Shades of Gender podcast. You can find us online at 50shadesofgender.com, as in FIFTY, on social media and on YouTube. Again, to support the podcast, visit the website to make a donation, join our community, find out more about our gender diversity and allyship workshops and courses, and how to contribute your gender story to the Anthology of Hope, for which we are accepting submissions now. Visit 50shadesofgender.com/hope for more information. We hope you will listen again. Until then, stay curious and open minded.
Sorry, that's my cat meowing in the background.
Yeah, I like that. Oh, I just got a glimpse of Cat. Hello, Cat. I love cats.
Yes, I also
Yeah.